he said, if you want to change the world, you need to be an architect. I thought, oh, that sounds like a good job description. I like that. And at 5, that's what I decided. And then whenever someone asked me for the rest of my life, that was the answer. For too long, the home has become a place you retreat to, almost for protection, where in all reality, it probably functions its best if it's a North Star or a point of departure where you leave. The hardest part with architecture and economic development is not finding a perfect project, it's finding a perfect client. I'd much rather work with a really interesting client on a simple project than a really complicated project with a simple owner.
You're listening to the NEI Pioneer Podcast, where we showcase and share the authentic stories of Northeast Indiana. If you're a new listener, welcome. We are so excited to share these impactful stories with you. Make sure to subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube and turn on post notifications so that you can be the first to know when we drop a new episode. Our guest today is President of MKM Architecture and Design, Zach Benedict. If you're in the Northeast Indiana area, then you've seen plenty of his team's work around town, including places like The Landing, Electric Works Housing, and the Arch United Center, as well as many other public spaces including libraries, hospitals, and living facilities. Their architectural handprint is all over our region. But what stands out to us the most about Zach and his team is their philosophy. Stay tuned for this episode to find out the why behind their work and what inspires and drives them. His answer might surprise you. So let's jump into the episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NEI Pioneer Podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts today, Brice Vance, and joining me today is
Jacob Ihrie, Director of Regional Initiatives.
And we have another special podcast for you today. Our guest today will be President of MKM Architecture and Design, Zach Benedict. Thanks for joining us, Zach.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe those who aren't familiar with MKM, what is it? And maybe what differentiates you guys from, say another architecture or design place?
MKM is a full-service architecture, interior design, urban design firm. What it is probably a more interesting question. We will joke that it functions at its best like an island of misfits. That's kind of how it functions in terms of operating more like a think tank than an architecture firm. So it has become over the years, I think, a really interesting and safe place for a collection of people to have these kind of odd and specific obsessions. Mine is not someone else that works at MKM. There's a partner at our office that I joke, he spends his nights sitting by the fire reading bulletins on new MRI equipment and stuff I couldn't be less interested in. But it's one of the things that is integral to his work and the value adds. Kind of working as a co-op that way, it's been an interesting way to be an umbrella for those folks whose sole focus really is to work on projects that have something to do with community health and well-being. So that's the mission of the firm.
How did you get into architecture? What's sort of your backstory of getting into it?
Most architects will tell you they decide to be an architect sometime in elementary school. Mm-hmm. If they ask you what you want to be when you grow up and you say architect, everyone lights up and says, oh, that would be great. Oh, yeah. So you're like, well, that must be the right answer. No one's criticizing it, and you just kind of live with it. And then before you know it, you're an architect.
Well, and I think you also have the benefit of having a job that people actually know.
Yeah,
you know, like you don't have to have a PowerPoint explaining your job function.
It's simple. They know it. They don't really know what you do day to day, but it sounds interesting. Mm-hmm. So no one talks you out of it, and then before you know it, you're in architecture school.
What kind of inspired you to kind of take that path? Was there something at a younger age that you're like, oh, this sounds cool. This job field looks interesting, or was it something decided on later on?
When I was 6 years old, I lived with my grandfather. Mm-hmm. He was an engineer by training. He used car salesman by profession. And I told him I wanted to be an engineer like him. And he said, no, if you want to change the world, you need to be an architect. And I thought, oh, that sounds like a good job description. I like that. Mm-hmm. And at 5, that's what I decided. And then whenever someone asked me for the rest of my life, that was the answer.
And to kind of connect that with MKM's, mantra and how I see your guys' designs work out. We have the quote, where we live changes how we live. And is that something that you think got instilled at that age, or is that something that you kind of stumbled upon through your career?
I mean, I think probably everyone at the firm comes at that from a little bit of a different angle. I got obsessed with kind of a specific niche of research in college called urban sociology, mm-hmm. which is really nothing more than the study of how places make people behave. Over the years, not lost that interest in how it might apply to the work. Like the retail industry knows it real well, right? There's a reason milk's in the back of the grocery store. Architecture by profession, I don't think is that nuanced or objective about it. It's harder to articulate where the milk is in your neighborhood, right? But there's a right answer to that, I think. So to try to explore how we can get better at understanding how to elevate the quality of life for people, if nothing more than to understand where the milk belongs, is kind of this idea of the built environment being a behavioral system, right? Where you live shapes how you live. And understanding its role in that equation, I think, is a burden of responsibility on our profession.
And I think, a lot of the work that you've been involved in, the Landing, a lot of senior living communities, hospitals, schools. How do you go about deciding that while you design?
It's tricky, I think, because we'll say we do projects that have something to do with community health and well-being. That sounds like it's got a nice, clean bow on it. But architecturally, it ranges widely from projects like the Landing to Homestead High School to Arts United. Like those architecturally are very different buildings. The milk's in a different spot. And so to understand that, I think, is a discussion on trying to be a better student of the human condition and know how these projects can help without getting in the bad habit of thinking it's going to solve all the world's problems. Right? Probably the biggest downside to the architecture profession is we've had a bad habit of thinking we can make the perfect environment, we can solve all these problems, and that's not at all, I think, how it functions. When you work on these projects, you tend to provide a platform for people to cooperate with each other, and that's about the extent you can offer. Beyond that, you're kidding yourself if you thought you could add more to that equation.
And I apologize for not remembering the term, and I'm sure that you might. Is we see this a lot. I'm from the urban planning side. We went to the same college, different floors, but we see that a lot in urban planning when people have their natural pathways.
Yeah.
And working around that and functioning and how we know a sidewalk's supposed to go straight. We know that it's supposed to have a corner. Everyone else forgets that that's true.
Right.
And just how, do you account for that when you're designing? Do you try to find those natural pathways, or is that where you kind of let, people decide for people?
I think there's two things going on there. One is just understanding the stubbornness of humans as a species, right? We're just a stubborn creature. The other is we want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. And the second we can't or don't feel that way, we act differently. And those two things tend to conflict with one another. So to try to understand how you can design places that can respect both of those realities simultaneously is what's the complicated and enjoyable part of architecture. Right? You could do things like, a lot of college campuses don't put sidewalks, they'll just plant grass, and then wherever there's a cow path made by students walking, that's where the sidewalk should have went. Right? You can be reactive that way, but it's not nudging any behavior. So with the projects we work on, largely places that if people were given the choice wouldn't inhabit, hospital, senior living facility, right? These aren't places people are going to because they're on vacation. They're places people need and are relying on. And I think those projects require a little bit more nudging than just a reactive response to human behavior.
When you look at design, are you looking to force interaction?
Yes. One of the things that you'll find, especially in a lot of the research, is you can go down a Google rabbit hole to a lot of scary statistics about mortality rates and zip codes. Right? There's a very clear predictor of longevity is your address. You tell me where you live, I can tell you about when you're going to die. Which, as depressing as that sounds,
yeah, I'm going to keep my address to myself.
It's an indictment on the economic development profession, right?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that easy, but it is. So if you're in a position where you want to desperately try to change that reality, which is kind of the backbone of our work, you have to nudge in a way that promotes a higher quality of life. And what you'll find is the most predictable way of doing that and kind of the inverse of that zip code analysis is the frequency of unplanned interactions, meaning the amount of times during the course of a day you might actually run into someone that you care about that was a surprise. That frequency really matters. So as much as you can nudge that number to go up and up on a daily basis, the better you probably will do for a whole series of cohorts regarding personal health and well-being.
And that attitude is a complete reversal of what we've seen in traditional neighborhood and community design. And that's something that you can tell when you really take the eagle eye view of what you've done, is kind of undoing a lot of that. We don't live in neighborhoods that make us feel like we can talk to our neighbors anymore.
Well, and for a long time, I think we've defined success by how many shared goods we could privatize. Like that's been the litmus test of someone that was successful. Is I live in a big house with a fence. I've claimed this territory as mine. I have a home gym, home office, home school. I must be successful. I don't need anybody for anything. And then we come to find out you need everyone for everything. And we build an economy around that tries to make you feel as though you're connected virtually so you don't panic. And that tension there is something that is worthy of undoing, right? To understand that cooperation is a currency of the human species. We have to figure out a way to do this, and we're not doing any favors to anybody if we make them live in these environments where it just makes it really impossible to do. We've done presentations where I compared in slow motion and gave an architectural commentary on the progression of Mr. Rogers coming home, like that whole scene at the beginning of every episode. Compare that to Bruce Wayne entering the Batcave. It's almost identical sequence, right? But the cave and Mr. Rogers' house are very different. And the way in which he comes home at the end of the day is a very different connotation, not only to his role with the people around him, but I think how he treats the outside world. For too long, the home has become a place you retreat to, almost for protection, where in all reality, it probably functions its best if it's a North Star or a point of departure where you leave, like to go explore the world and not to protect yourself from it. And that's where we've probably made our biggest mistake.
I hope you mean the royal we and not just us in this room.
Correct.
Okay.
I would hope.
I thought we were in trouble. Well, another thing I wanted to talk about is how MKM has made some real big strides for equitable interaction too, and designing spaces that are easy to navigate and to move through for people kind of regardless of ability. Your fingerprints are all over the Arts United Center.
Yes.
I know that because I've been working on that myself. And a big portion of that is accessible design, and how MKM's working on, building an accessible community space.
The Arts United project's interesting because it's designed by one of the most famous architects to ever walk the planet. One we were audacious enough to hire before he was famous, and then became internationally famous while working with Fort Wayne. It was built in 1974, pre-ADA. So there was actually some things that he did that were probably ahead of its time and a little progressive when it comes to accessibility, but by today's standards, nothing is compliant. And one of the things that was interesting about that project specifically when it comes to accessibility and equity, there's two really unique users to that space. There's the audience and the performers. And as a community theater, both are members of our community. It's not like a traveling road show where these strangers from outside of our community come and put on a play, right? They're people that are in your community. They just happen to be actors or building sets for the stage. So there's this kind of interplay between these two different user groups of this shared building, both of which in the current design had a real hard time maneuvering through that space. And in some ways weren't intended in the original building to ever interact with each other besides the optics of the performance itself. There's not a way to get from the front of the building to the back. Not a non-accessible, there's not a way to do it. So part of the project was not only modernizing the theater and increasing accessibility, but in some way trying to better intermingle these two audiences so there could be a little bit more interaction. There could be a little bit more flexibility in the use of the space and the audience that it's trying to serve, both in the crowd but also on stage.
it's a wonderful project that like I've said, I've had to be a little more involved with through our work here, and it's been wonderful to fund that.
It's someone asked me how stressful it is to work on a Louis Kahn building, because it's not something you do every day. And I said, well, it's probably not nearly as stressful as watching someone else do it. So I'll take it, but
well, I mean,
it's
judging by the paperwork I've seen, you did work on it every day for a couple of years.
Yeah.
There,
No,
so,
it's a once in a lifetime opportunity.
It's good
for
to
sure.
know that the feeling doesn't wear off.
Yeah, no, it does not.
Another thing we want to talk about, kind of going back to the design and how we're designed for digital interaction. Is there any changes that you see as far as AI goes into the architecture field? And it's one of those things where we want our buildings designed by humans for humans, but do you think that's in the cards forever?
I read the other day that it was ironic that whenever we talked about AI decades ago, we always talked about it freeing us up by allowing it to handle all of the hard work, so we could spend our time doing art and paint and poetry. And now we have AI and ChatGPT, and we have it do art and write poetry, and like do all the things that we said we were going to do when we had more free time in our hands, while we're still digging ditches and building things. So I'm nervous about the role AI would have in the creative side of the design profession. Not that we're doing a perfect job, but trying to understand where that would dehumanize the conversation. Part of the struggle with architecture isn't necessarily the technical side of making it buildings that don't fall down, roof doesn't leak, sure, is trying in some way to empower the people that own or use the space to understand how it best can be used as a tool. So, for example, when we interviewed for the landing, the selection committee was talking with us and the developer and asked me what I thought the most challenging design problem might be for the landing. And my answer was to make sure before we're done that we still saved room for a good snowball fight, because that gets lost in the mix of budgets and pro forma and rent rates and occupancy of retailers and restaurants. And at the end of the day, we wanted this thing to be different than what you could at the time get downtown was a neighborhood, in and of itself, one that the tenants could take it over and do what they wanted, like have their own snowball fight without permission or scheduling it on a calendar or involving some marketing committee to say that Saturday is going to be this big thing. It just would organically happen. I have a hard time reconciling in my brain how AI promotes that.
Well, I've got my own worries about it from the economic development side. Something that I constantly worry about when we're looking at projects to fund or what's getting built or what to bring is I'm scared about having a building that's reusable.
Yeah.
And just it's another nod to your work in the landing, and something that we have in that more embracing of classic architecture is buildings evolve and they change and businesses come and go, but there has to be that communal connection point.
Yeah, and the best ones are the nimble ones.
And we have to be able to preserve them.
Yeah.
And I think that we get so obsessed with efficiency that we lose form.
Right.
And and with form, going back to some of the projects, how do you compartmentalize in your firm how to build a library or a school, and then take a lot of that same staff, I'm assuming the gentleman who reads about MRI technology, and put that implementation into the hospitals?
So we don't have studios, like specialized, like we don't have a team that just does nothing but operating rooms, and I think that makes us better designers. It's almost like being cross-trained, across all architecture platforms. I think we do better rural hospitals because we do good libraries, and vice versa. And in that way, the benefit is, I think, as a designer, if I'm talking selfishly, I think it keeps you sharp, right? To understand. We say this a lot in my office. There's a Charlie Munger quote. I'd prefer you show me where I die, so I never go there. right? And in some ways, these projects are that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not a question or a quest on this perfect solution. It's, well, let's figure out what rabbit holes, this project would die, and figure out why that's the case and how do we insulate it from that reality. So when you look at things like the experience of using a building like a hospital or a library, there's a wide range of user groups to that. And we try to be as empathetic as possible to the extreme of those usages. So like when we get a new staff person out of school, one of the things we'll sometimes ask them is, you give them a program like you do, architects get these programs. You design me a space that holds X amount of people and blah, blah, blah. You can say, well, design a waiting room for 25 people and give them a couple consult rooms off of a surgical suite. Simple, innocent thing. And they all kind of draw it and struggle in the same way. And then when they're done, you ask them to kind of tell you what they're thinking and walk them through the process. And you do these consult rooms, they all draw them, this kind of small little room with a couple chairs in it. And I said, well, what happens in that room? Well, I don't know. It's the consult room. Mm-hmm. Well, no, that's the room a woman would find out she's a widow. That would happen in that room, in this setting. And their face just kind of drops, like it's a different exercise now. Mm-hmm. And then you say, okay, you want to try this again? And they're like, yeah, I want to try this again. And it's not to lose the sensitivity to that especially in some of our projects, they house some of the most transformational moments in people's life. Not all bad, but transformational nonetheless. And trying to understand how the building can help support them as an individual in those experiences is where we spend the majority of our time arguing in my office about, is there a better way to support them? Is this space offering what we need it to offer for this person going through this experience? Mm-hmm. And those are the swords, worth dying on.
I think with those communal spaces, it's always weird because you're designing for contradictions. Like so often, hospitals, happiest moment in someone's life, new baby, or worst moments in someone's life. Public libraries, they're these spaces that are, by and large, the only places that communities engage in kind of gathering, especially in rural communities. But also, like, we all have the old, in designing around that and just integrating that it's so impressive to me, and that's very painful to admit as a planner. So there's a rivalry there. There is. Yeah. They got, it's architecture and planning at Ball State. It's not planning and architecture like it should be. It's important.
I can really feel the tension.
It is. And would you say that's the favorite part of the job, though, is the challenges, or is it the ribbon cuttings?
No, I don't. Truth be told, I don't like those.
I see you at a lot of them.
Yeah, I don't like them. I don't like them because it's done then. Mm-hmm. It's stressful. I don't like going through buildings I have done. No different than I've seen like actors say they don't watch the movies they're in. Like, I get that. Because you just look at all the things you should have done or could have done, and it's not the same. I like groundbreakings, but ribbon cuttings have this finality to them that I don't necessarily like.
Feel free to say pass on this, but is there a feature or a moment, like, or something that you remember from a project that you could just, if you could go back and do that part differently, the whole project would, be a monumental, greater success for you?
I turn 44 next month. I'm just to the point now where I can walk through one of my projects. So it took a little bit. And I wouldn't take that back, though. I wouldn't change that. I don't think regret's probably the right word. I think you learn from that. And architecture is an interesting profession. It's an apprentice-based profession that it's hard to learn without doing. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, you need to find a safe place where you have some freedom to grow as a designer, which is great. The challenge and maybe the humble part is all the stuff that you've grown out of is now these 50-year-old buildings that are going to live and not going anywhere anytime soon. It's not like when you're trying to get good at painting, you just hide all the bad paintings and you wait till they're good to show people. Architecture is not that way, right? All your early paintings are built somewhere. So it is an interesting journey. I don't know a better way to do it, but it is a good feeling to start finally being able to appreciate some things, I guess.
So is that how you would define success now, though? Is being able to walk through your own buildings?
No, I mean that's a new feeling. Probably, I mean, like 2 years old maybe, where I finally walked through something I did and went, I like this, and could say that, and that was the end of it. That's a newer feeling. Success is probably something different. We're not really interested in doing perfect work or being the best. It's a continual kind of strive to be better, and which is exhausting, I think, to some, maybe to some clients. I don't know, but success is having some sense of confidence that you are a little smarter than you were yesterday, a little better than we were yesterday. I mean, so we do a lot of conference presentations, that kind of stuff, not because we like to hear ourselves talk, but it forced us over the years to actually have an opinion about something, and then second guess whether or not we actually agreed with the opinion. So if I could watch a presentation we gave 10 years ago, it'd probably make me cringe. And success is, I think, what I'm saying today is more right than what we were saying 10 years ago. And I hope in 10 years I say the same thing about what I'm saying today. So that's success.
Cringe?
Oh, I want to feel like, yes, no, that's probably true.
Okay.
Yes, because I want to, if I look back from what I was doing 10 years ago today and was totally fine with it, that would feel like failure.
Well, good. I'll cringe at this too then.
That would bother
you.
me a lot, I think.
Hi, everyone. We want to take a quick moment to shout out our podcast sponsors. Now, first, you might be wondering who I am, so let me introduce myself. I am Hannah Hannigan, and normally I'm behind the camera as the videographer, but today I wanted to be in front of the camera to shout out the people who made this podcast possible. Barrett McNagny and Sweetwater Sound are the two sponsors of our podcast, and they're both located in Northeast Indiana. If you don't already know who they are, let me introduce them to you. We're going to start with Barrett McNagny. As Fort Wayne has grown, the Barrett Law Firm has grown with it. Founded in 1876, Barrett McNagny is one of the oldest law partnerships in Indiana, and it's among one of the largest just in Northeast Indiana. They have the breadth of experience across a wide range of practice areas to provide you trusted legal counsel where and when you need it. And Sweetwater is actually the one we were able to purchase most of our audio and video gear from to make this podcast. So if you like how this podcast sounds or how it looks, be sure to check them out. Sweetwater, the nation's largest, and I would also add friendliest destination for music gear, is also your one-stop shop for all things podcasting. From audio interfaces, recording software, mixers, microphones, cameras, and lighting, Sweetwater has everything to get your podcast up and running. Enjoy personalized gear advice from their dedicated team of sales engineers, as well as free technical support to get your podcast connected and up and running. Really, what's not to love about that? So whether you already have a following or you're still chasing the next big thing, Sweetwater is going to be the ones to help you create a podcast that everyone will be talking about. So if you're interested in either of these companies, be sure to check out the links in our description. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
You know, I think I struggled as well when, being the copywriter here and, previous jobs as a writer. Going back and looking, when I first started in my writing career, almost a decade ago now, I would look back at it and ooh, I probably could have written that better, done it, some of the stuff I was at the time I was like, oh, this is great. But then now I get to this certain point when I write here, it's like, yeah, I probably could have done things differently there. And I feel like I've improved, over the course. You said it's been about 2 years since you're like, okay, I can walk in and what was it that, shifted? Was it just having the experience of doing this for so long, or was it, there's a certain marker where you're like, okay, now we can look back at this and appreciate it?
I'm sure some of it's just experience and confidence. But maybe more than that is it's a smaller set of unknowns, right? When especially for an architect, when you're right out of school, you don't know anything.
Yeah,
nothing. Tell your planning friends I said that. Nothing.
I'm actually going to get a clip of that to send
right?
everyone.
You know nothing. Even the education itself's not designed to prepare you for the profession. It's designed to make you a critical thinker and a problem solver.
Mm-hmm.
They put it on the profession to teach architects how to become professional architects. So you're dealing with all that, plus the insecurity of just being young and inexperienced. So I think once you can kind of get through the noise of just how to be a functioning adult and professional, then you can start fully just focusing on the work, which is a little bit more palatable. And so I think there is some of that. There's just so much variables that you just have no clue how to handle at the time, that I have found really exciting, but it's clumsy, right? I mean, it's clumsy to. In some ways, it's a profession that our firm functions like a teaching hospital, right? You got to watch me do this procedure, but the next one you're doing, and I'll be here so you don't, hurt anybody, but
I'll tie the artery up.
Yeah, right.
Right. Like,
but we all know it probably won't go too well.
Yeah.
That's why I'm standing here, watching. And so we all have these people over your shoulder that never tend to go away. And that's just kind of been the hallmark of architecture. And I don't know a better way to teach it, but it is a process.
Well, I think, again, back to a point earlier is with architecture, you do have to build in room to fix those mistakes to a degree with that nimbleness. And I think the grander, the onset of the idea for that, the harder it is to fix those ideas. And when you're trying to do these big standalone projects, you definitely set yourself up for 50, 60 to 100 years of that look back.
Well, and then you're balancing it with budget. So you could have a perfect solution, and then someone say, well, it needs to be 20% cheaper. How do you do that and remain have this design hold some sense of integrity? The hardest part with architecture and economic development is not finding a perfect project; it's finding a perfect client. Right? And the projects are projects, but I'd much rather work with a really interesting client on a simple project than a really complicated project with a simple owner.
It's like the illusion of freedom with some of the things is you want to work with somebody that you can have guidance, but you want someone who also will give you the rope. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
some leash to play with.
And aren't hiring you with some prescriptive solution already in their head, right? I do a lot of work with public libraries, not as much because I like them as a building. I do, but I stereotypically adore public librarians. They're kind of a different species of human, and that is what makes those projects so rewarding. Is they get up every day trying to make their community a little bit better than it was yesterday, and the building's just one of the tools to do that. That's a lot more fun to talk about than having a 2-hour meeting about how much shelving they need for how many books. Like, we'll have that conversation, but that's not the project, and that's not what really is the metric of success here. And that's why I like that project type so much, is not because of libraries as a building or a piece of architecture, but because consistently librarians have been such amazing clients.
Where do you draw inspiration from? Whether it is inside the world of architecture or even outside of it.
Wow, no one's asked me that in a while. I think what's interesting about our work is, in some ways, maybe this sounds corny, the inspiration comes from the reality that we have clients that do amazing work. Like because of the projects we work on, that's a pretty consistent fact. Our clients are saving people's lives, teaching people how to dig themselves out of poverty. Like they're amazing stories. There's amazing people doing this tremendous work, and we get to provide them the place to do that. And if the platforms in which we provide them make them 10% more effective of doing this amazing work, I get some small satisfaction in taking a little bit of credit, for the impact they have. That's inspiring. I mean, to watch these folks do what they do, everything from libraries and hospitals to affordable housing to hospice care. Right? These are unbelievably important moments in people's lives that have to happen somewhere. There's a physical requirement to this that if we do our job well, maybe hopefully makes them just slightly more effective. And getting to know these people and the work they do and why they get up and go to work every day. There's a burden of responsibility there that our team finds inspiring. Like that what we're doing matters because the clients we have do meaningful work. And that I think is something that hasn't faded.
And with your work on the elderly and aging populations, I got introduced via you to ideas of kind of that full life community.
Yeah.
And because I do think that there is a disconnect there where we have this attitude that the elderly need to be, for some reason, corralled.
Yes.
Into a senior community, but like everything says that that's not the way to go about it. But at the same time, we kind of have zoned people into staying into these homes that are too big for their needs and not getting a lot of nimbleness in there. And I was wondering if you could talk about any of your work to kind of expand or connect those whole life communities.
Yeah, the aging thing's interesting because aging wasn't a problem for human species for a couple thousand years. It's only recently been problematic. And it's an outgrowth of us building these really ineffective communities that made aging, if not only cumbersome, something that no one wanted to admit happened. Like we have I have a friend that calls them Peter Pan neighborhoods because you assume no one's getting older ever. And that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And because then we find ourselves upside down in a situation like that, whether it's simply out of preference or debt or mortgage, whatever it is, you become trapped. So one of the solutions that the market had for this was, we'll create a special place for them to go where it's more age-friendly. Ironically, it wasn't that much more age-friendly either. It's all vehicular-based, retirement communities. But that's only about 3% of the market. So of everyone in this country that's could satisfy the requirements of an age-qualified neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
only about 3% live in age-qualified housing. So ARP and other folks will tell you that, this is a big part of the equation. It's not. Most people are too stubborn to do that, even if they could. So it's more trying to understand how we can reconcile the existing environment. And that has become kind of the more interesting challenge, both for design professionals, but I think city leaders, is trying to understand how to capture that cohort, not
Mm-hmm.
only politically, but economically, right?
Yeah.
So to understand that is interesting. What I find more interesting is we do a lot of work with the aging discussion, primarily because they have disposable income and some political power. But any recommendation you'd give for the built environment to support an older adult is the exact same recommendation you'd give to support a pre-driving teen. Right? There's really no difference
Mm-hmm.
there. It's the two ends of that bell curve have less agency than those that in this country can drive. So for most these conversations, it's trying to admit that for the last 50, 60 years, we've made most of our economic development decisions around an egomaniac male who can drive. And now we have to figure out how to right-size that because that's not the case anymore. And try to figure out in some way how to convince people that there's cost embedded in that,
Mm-hmm.
and that you can't just simply say, well, we can't afford that. Well, you can't afford not to. Or you can't afford not to embrace a way to engage people that are over the age of 65 or under the age of 16. And there's a real, I think, epidemic in not acknowledging that these things are real. So you can track the growth of suburban sprawl in the United States since 1960, and it almost identically matches the growth of teenage suicide. Like, that's a real depressing but true thing. And just as equally ostracized on the senior side of
Mm-hmm.
that equation, right? But to try to understand how that built environment can support them in a way is interesting. So we've been doing a lot of work over the last decade or so in trying to figure out more creative ways of providing projects or empowering clients to understand the power of creating neighborhoods that were able to accommodate people of all ages and abilities. Right? So that's always kind of been the tagline. And in some ways, it can be really academic and objective. There's a lot of research you can go around. You hear terms like walkable a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If you told me 35% of my population's 70 or older, walkable probably should mean something different than it would if we were talking about, an active college town. Very different. So there's the science part of it, but then there's also just the emotional side of it, of just understanding how to leverage this idea of disposable time. And that's probably the biggest benefit to this, besides the health benefits to the individual, is the diversity in time. And the only example I can use is when I first bought a house here in Fort Wayne. I bought a typical starter house, whatever, and my brother was teasing me that I didn't have a security system. I didn't have one. I didn't need one. I had a lady that lived across the street from me. She was 96. Her name was Noreen, and she ended up calling the cops on my brother 3 times, because he'd come over. If I wasn't home, he'd look through the window, right, and she'd call the cops on him. And so I don't need a security system. I have Noreen. But Noreen was retired and had nothing better to do than stare out her window and look at my house and look out for me and, my family. That's, this kind of secondary benefit to these neighborhoods is the diversity of not only people and economic household income, all that, but time, like how we use our day, and this kind of shared management of these places. And that's where we've seen the biggest benefit in some of these projects.
Just to harp on planning for a little bit, because I want to give Ball State a shout out. The first thing they teach, we fly. That's the new one. I like it. But one of the first things they do at Ball State Urban Planning School, shout out to John West, Dr. John West, is they teach us what we did wrong, and I get kind of the same vibe from the architecture students.
Yeah.
We talk about our failures because it's a huge overlap where in planning you have to stare at it for a long time. At architecture you have to stare at it a long time, and in planning we've had this conversation before, but how far we build homes back from the street has really done a lot to destroy our relationship with our neighbors. You have to, if you're on the sidewalk and your neighbor's on the porch, you have to yell at them or encroach on their personal property, both of which are not things that Midwesterners are apt to do.
What project are you most proud of?
Oh, that's where I'm supposed to give you this corny answer that they're all like your children and you like them all equally. That's not true.
Oh, no, I want you to throw shade.
Yeah, no, that's definitely not true. But
you can give multiple. I mean, I imagine over the course of 20 years, there's more than
my
just
favorite
one.
ones are the harder ones,
Yeah.
right? So the Landing Museum of Art, a handful of retirement communities. I think we just did a really interesting renovation of the Fullinger Foundation. And then we've done, I think, planned or designed 55 libraries over the last 10 years. So, and I kind of lump all those into one just journey of trying to think through that project type.
And when you say hard, maybe the most, the listener may not know what hard means, because when they go to the Landing, like, oh, this is beautiful.
Yeah,
like,
and
well,
there's
what do you mean
different,
by
different
hard? And
versions
obviously
of
different.
hard, I guess. The Landing was interesting because it was so financially complicated. There was a lot of funding streams coming together, and there was and I worked on that for 6 years.
Yeah.
So these bigger projects for architects, you can almost measure out your career in just a handful of projects. Well, we just did groundbreaking for Arts United.
Yep.
The same week my youngest son started high school. I started Arts United when he was in kindergarten. So you just you start seeing like your life through these projects. So hard in some ways is just stamina.
Right.
And just keeping these projects moving forward and not quitting. But in some ways, I think some projects are harder kind of below the surface because our team's arguing and struggling with them so much, maybe even to the extent the client wouldn't know.
You've also been working on a pattern book that I think is, incredibly innovative. And I was wondering if you could just explain to our listeners what that is, because when I heard what it was, I was like, oh, like cloth?
Yeah. So, and I don't know what it's going to be yet. We're probably 2/3 of the way through thinking through this. We got asked to try to explore what we thought was kind of the phrase missing middle's overused, but this idea of where there were gaps in how Northeast Indiana was approaching housing. Gaps in both strategy, but also product of home. and then maybe explore why and provide some recommendation of what might be an interesting consideration moving forward. So right now, current demand is assuming about 23,000 new homes, something like that.
The latest update in the data was closer to 28.
Okay, so brand new homes
Mm-hmm.
in Northeast Indiana, 11 counties. So to use that as an opportunity, I mean, we talked about planning mistakes, right? Here's your one opportunity to right a bunch of wrongs and figure out how to move the needle forward in planning terms in a fairly quick manner. So how do you leverage that opportunity as something that could be really, fairly transformational? So we've been spending the last 6 months or so arguing, debating, exploring what that might mean in a way that we're hopeful is palatable to the folks that will ultimately be the ones building this. One of the interesting things about housing, especially small scale attached and almost all of detached, is they don't involve the architecture community. I mean, it's not a thing that is just normal for Midwest. It is in other areas of the world, but not here. So to understand how we can provide some recommendations and maybe some guidance on why some of these things are important, I have some faith that these people looking for these homes, if they were given the choices between a normal suburban 3-car garage versus a really interesting smaller house with a porch closer to the street,
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm pretty confident I know what they'd pick. That's not an option in a lot of cases. So when you talk about 28,000 new opportunities to select that option, I think that's a really exciting opportunity for the region. So we were trying to help put together some sort of report that we hope to roll out here in November that will outline maybe some of the issues and missing components within these neighborhoods, and then try to paint a story on a couple building typologies, housing typologies that we think are either misunderstood or under-leveraged that we think should be a huge part of this discussion to try to fill some of this demand in the short and long term.
And we've had those conversations internally too, on especially on the regional initiatives team, about building new homes and how we've expanded them is incredibly expensive. You have to expand infrastructure, lay sidewalks, put roads, and that's before a house. Well, not sidewalks, but that's before a house gets built. And just kind of figuring out how to leverage how we used to build houses to see if we can fill in those broken teeth in neighborhoods that already have infrastructure and character,
Right.
and humanity. I don't think there's anything more lonely than being the first house done in a new subdivision.
Right.
I've been there.
You have been there, yeah, recently.
Yeah. And it can be lonely.
It's weird.
It can be scary too at night when
That's
there's
weird.
a lot of
It's weird, isn't it?
yeah, there's a lot of in darkness. There's no maybe one street light on your street, but you're just out there by yourself.
I mean, we did all this research for this initiative and researched all these case studies and came up with these prototypes. All that to say, I think the litmus test for a good housing product is any street that is really good at trick-or-treating.
That's good.
It's that simple, I think.
Yeah.
Right? And you can gauge a lot of the zip code analysis, mortality rates, health and all this stuff. My kids could tell you what street probably is performing better, if nothing else, if they just picked where they wanted to go for trick-or-treating. And that's where we're trying to fix this. So new construction, that's a little easier. I can tell you how to make a perfect trick-or-treating street. But one that's a horrible street for trick-or-treating, like how do you fix that in the private market without relying on a bunch of grants and funding and development incentives? Like how do you convince the market rate for-profit folks there's opportunity there to fix that, to right that wrong? And trick-or-treating is as good as a way of I think you can explain that.
Just
in a way.
full-size candy bars.
Yeah.
I will gladly review a grant for a full-size candy bar.
We'll send
just
one.
one
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that is exciting new coming up next for MKM, or anything you'd like to promote?
As a personal philosophy, it's a horrible business decision. I don't promote MKM much. There's nothing to sell. We're more interested in working with clients than we are working on projects. So we do a lot of pro bono work. We do a lot of research. In terms of the business itself, no. That's just not how we've ever approached the company. But the work, I think, is interesting because we are finding more and more understanding of the urgency of this, of understanding what a livable community really means, the fact that planning doesn't reconcile or fix itself quickly, right? Someone the other day told me, you buy a bad dishwasher, it's like a 3-year mistake. You put a cul-de-sac in the wrong spot, it's a 100-year accident, right? If not longer. So the thing we're probably promoting is more than anything is the urgency of this, not only selfishly because I want to see progress in these discussions, but we just know how slow it would go without pushing. So we spend more of our time promoting these ideas as best we can, anywhere we can, if nothing else, so that they become part of the normal discussion in these communities throughout the Midwest. Because I do think the Midwest is a unique problem. I maybe a different way to say it is you can track states by how unwell they are, and people will say, well, it's a rural issue. It's not a rural issue. Some of the healthiest states are very rural. It's a Midwestern problem. All of the unhealthy states are Midwestern states. And we have to take this as people that are on the front lines of this problem as a way to try to figure out how to promote the ideas, articulate the urgency of the issues, and figure out in some way to stop talking about them without doing something to help move the needle. So that's where we spend our energy if we're promoting anything.
Well, I hope you don't mind if I keep promoting you.
You're allowed to. No, that's totally fine.
All right, as we wrap up here, we're going to do rapid fire questions.
Bring it.
Favorite architect?
Eero Saarinen.
Why?
I named my dog after Eero Saarinen.
Oh.
That's not why, though.
Okay.
Eero, because nothing he did looked the same. Like, especially architects, like these really famous. You can go through the portfolio of their work, and everything is an iteration of itself.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. Eero, everything is just completely different. And I just love the idea that everything was unique to the problem, and there's no pattern book or default solution.
Is there something on your bucket list? Something that you haven't gotten to design yet, or skydiving? Let's get broad with it.
Outside of architecture, my new obsession is trying to turn my 2 sons into world travelers. So my wife and I have made the decision that we're going to try to get them as many places as possible, which has been a really fun adventure. So that's where we spend free time, is planning, like, what's next.
Is there a destination that's like out of reach that you have to go to?
No, but like this last spring, we took them to London and Paris, and they had never been outside of the States. And then this next spring, we're going to take them to Scotland, I think.
So we got the favorite architect. Is there a favorite building? Fort Wayne, otherwise?
Most impressed I've ever been was at the Miller House, which the public can now see in Indianapolis. And that's legitimately, I think, one of the more impressive buildings I've ever been in. I made my brother go because it had not been open to the public for years, and they finally opened it up a couple years ago. And he's an economist, finance guy, doesn't dig art or architecture, and we both were just blown. Everyone should go see it. It's phenomenal.
As 3 guys from Noble County, when we did the research on you, Jake told me that you're an East Noble grad.
Yep.
Favorite spot to eat in Noble County?
St. James.
That's surprising.
It's because it's the right answer.
Yeah.
It's also still got the best chicken.
Oh,
We did talk about that earlier today.
Well, that has to be the right answer.
Well, we have a blog series here that I run, and that was not the winner.
It was second
winner.
place, though, right?
It was second place. Albion Ale House ended up winning, but it was neck and neck for a while in the voting. But I get the nostalgic of
St. James.
So I'm gonna just.
I'm also from a villa, so.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for joining us.
No,
today.
thanks for having me.
MKM also has their own web series and
Yeah.
place to learn, and I was wondering if you could just let our listeners know where to find that.
Everything we do versus whether it's we do a little discussion thing called Health as Membership, and there's conference presentations and some other chats. We put all that on the firm's YouTube page, so you can find it there.
And I really suggest everyone, do. It's the work you guys do is very impressive. We're
Thank
really
you.
lucky to have you, and I hope we can finally get that coffee we talked about a couple years ago.
I owe it to you. Yeah.
Well, we'll make sure to link that in the description of this podcast. Zach, thank you so much for coming in. For Jake, I'm Brice. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the NEI Pioneer Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, also on Apple Podcast and Spotify, and you can also find it at pioneerstartshere.com.